Religion has profoundly influenced the sweeping American narrative, perhaps more than any other force in our history, from the time of the indigenous peoples to the present day. The National Museum of American Religion tells the surprising and compelling story of what religion has done to America and what America has done to religion, including the establishment of the revolutionary and indispensable idea of religious freedom as a governing principle in the U.S., inviting all to explore the role of religion in shaping the social, political, economic, and cultural lives of Americans and thus America itself. Join us for Season 3 of our podcast series, Religion and the American Experience, as we follow scholars and others deep into America's religious history and learn how it can inform and animate us as citizens grappling with complex questions of governance and American purpose in the 21st century. Episodes will be released monthly on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, welcome to another episode of Religion in the American Experience. Today we will pull on this thread of the American religious tapestry, the history and significance of Virginia's oldest church, St. Luke's Historic Church in Smithfield, Virginia, by talking with John Ericson, the Executive Director of St. Luke's Historic Church and Museum. Mr. Smith has a BA in History and a Master's of Divinity from the Lutheran Theological Seminary at Gettysburg. John, welcome, and thank you for being with us.
It's nice to be here, Chris. Thank you so much.
Let's get right to it. St. Luke's was built when and by whom?
So our best physical evidence suggests that it was completed about 1685 to 86. The major patron of the church was a gentleman by the name of Joseph Bridger, who was a Cavalier, a pro-monarchist during the English Civil Wars, and really becomes an exile because he's on the losing side of the monarchists.
Okay. And so what happened between the late 17th century there in Virginia when it was built and the Revolutionary War? So what was St. Luke's doing during that time?
So St. Luke's was it wasn't called St. Luke's at the time. It was just called the Brick Church, later the Old Brick Church. And it was a part, of course, of the established Church of England. And it was part of a parish system. It was called the Lower Parish because there was an upper parish. And it was, of course, the dominant religious expression in the Virginia colony. You had to pay your highest tax to your local parish. It was called the tithe, not a voluntary tithe, a tax. And you had to worship at least once a month. Otherwise, the magistrate could come looking for you. So it's kind of the seat of power. Even localities would be called tithings back in those days, showing the centrality of the church in the Virginia colony. So it's while there are other denominations that can maneuver a little bit within the colony, but definitely suppressed to the established church.
Okay. And what was going on in Smithfield at that time?
So late 17th century into the early 18th century, there's no real center of town. Smithfield's going to be incorporated in 1732. I'm sorry, 1752. So in this time, there's just scattered plantations. Tobacco, of course, is the king commodity, making wealth for at least the small one percenters. It's a time, after the several wars with indigenous people had taken place throughout the 17th century. So it's a time where it's going to see some prosperity for the English colonists, to be sure. It's mostly, of course, an agricultural community. South side of the James River, a little bit away from the seat of power. And in the early part of the history, you'll see a lot of dissenting groups, but certainly by the time that our church building is built, the established church has taken firm root.
Okay. And how many parishioners can it hold?
Yeah, so our the way we count currently, about 120 or so, it can handle. Now, back in the day, the seating was a little different. They had boxed pews, and I don't know exactly what the seating capacity would have been. But they also had, in addition to our church building, what they called chapels of ease, which were smaller places for worship out in the more rural areas. They might even be somebody's house, but they wanted some place like every 5 miles or so to show you really the significance of the established church throughout the colony, because it was a legal entity as well as a religious one.
Chapels of Ease. Never heard of those. That's cool.
Yeah, chapels of ease. So we know about several chapels of ease within our parish system, um, and we've done some videos out on those locations.
Okay. So, can you describe what happened during the Revolutionary War there at
Well,
St. Luke's?
yeah, fortunately for us, not a lot, and I say that because some neighboring places, especially on the other side of the James River, sustain significant damage. And so the fact that we still have an extant building from the 17th century tells you something about us being a little bit away from scenes of conflict. There was a small skirmish in the later part of the war, 1781. It's called the Battle or Skirmish of Mackey's Mill, which was uh, local militia forces trying to fend off Benedict Arnold's troops as he had already defected to the British side and was striking out from Richmond into eastern Virginia, eventually taking Portsmouth. So there was a local Colonel Josiah Parker who actually took the surrender at the Battle of Trenton in the Revolutionary War, who's fending off Arnold as best as he could. But eventually, they're going to continue their march down to Portsmouth.
Okay. You write, John, that nothing is known between then, the Revolutionary War period, and 1821, when a deacon of the Protestant Episcopal Church named W.G.H. Jones began holding missionary society meetings there. What is its history between then, 1821, and through the Civil War? And what was it used for in the Civil War? Was it used for something during the Civil War?
Yeah, so initially in the 1820s, this deacon who eventually becomes a minister of the Episcopal Church is holding services again. It had kind of gone out of use from the early 19th century when the last colonial minister passed away. Um, and so they begin the worship in the old building again in the 1820s. Uh, that's when the nickname of St. Luke's comes in 1828, we see the first use of that name for this site. And then in 1832, the parish will get a gift of a piece of land in the town of Smithfield. The proper uh, town of Smithfield is about 5 miles down the road. And they're going to build a building on that site and move in 1836 and become Christ Episcopal Church, which is the existing congregation. And our building will be abandoned. And by the 1850s, Bishop Meade, the third bishop for the Diocese of Virginia of the Episcopal Church, scribbles a little note to the diocese saying the old brick church has been gutted. And we have pictures of it just after the Civil War of that difficult appearance of it having been totally gutted of all of its wood. And there was a plaster barrel ceiling that had a big gap in it, and the original windows were gone. So by the time of the American Civil War, it was already in pretty bad condition, and there's no suggestion that it was used for anything in particular during the war. There was a camp called Camp Ruffin that was just a little bit to the south of us here, which was just troops doing uh, guard duty, waiting to go into the Peninsula Campaign of 1862. These were 3rd North Carolina Infantry under William Dorsey Pender, who died of his wounds from the Battle of Gettysburg at Pickett's Charge. So Again, not a significant amount of any further damage from the war itself. So the
Okay.
frame of the building stays intact, which really lovely.
Sure. Right, right. So now we'll jump all the way to the 1930s and to the 1950s when it was renovated in conjunction with some event in Jamestown. Can you fill in any details of, if any, from the Civil War to the 1930s and then into the 50s?
Yep.
Give us an idea of what was going on.
So the biggest thing begins in 1885. They're going to form a committee over at Christ Episcopal Church in Smithfield to renovate the building. They'll call it a restoration, but I really call it a renovation because they're not going to restore it to its original appearance. They didn't really know much about that in the 1880s. And they're just going to kind of make it look churchy to their own Victorian tastes. And so they're going to begin that renovation. They don't get to work very much until a big storm in 1887 that dropped a tree onto the chancel roof and damaged it. And then they get to work pretty urgently, and they restore it or renovate it, putting in stained glass windows, which weren't really in American churches until the 19th century, about the 1840s. Very much in vogue by the 1880s, and they're going to dedicate a lot of the windows to local families and to historic figures. We've got a Pocahontas window, a George Washington commemoration, Robert E. Lee, various things like that. So that concludes in 1894, and they will restore the high-backed pews, but they're way too fancy for what would have been in the 17th century. They built a very extensive, elaborate gallery that, again, was more Victorian than 17th century. Uh, and it's going to be used occasionally by the folks at Christ Episcopal Church, but it's going to take, again, some significant damage between that renovation and the 1930s. And we'll see by the 1930s some significant deterioration of the buttresses on the outside of the building and on the interior.
Okay. This was the time of Jim Crow. Any understanding of any black parishioners or any interactions between black and white there in the area regarding the church at all?
Yeah, so it's certainly a time of heightened racism, and we'll see, you know, in the history, even well into the 20th century, rules against having African Americans buried in the old graveyard. There is a significant exception to that. There's a family plot to the north of the church building with some wrought iron fencing around it. And one of the stones says to our mammy, clearly a reference to an African American woman who was buried with the family. So she must have been held in high regard. But certainly, racist codes were very much in place during that period and well into the 1940s.
Right. Okay. That's interesting. That lady was buried with the family. I'd like to come
Yeah,
down.
it really was. We just renovated that little plot. There's a little Eagle Scout project going on to paint the fence and everything. And it's always one we kind of point out because it is kind of an outlier.
Right. Right. Okay. Thank you for that. So, what was going on in the 50s when there was some sort of association with something going on in Jamestown, and there was an effort to renovate, correct, in this time?
That's right. So there were three spinster ladies. They were called the Jordan sisters. It's spelled like Jordan, but it's pronounced Jordan. And they were quite a force to be reckoned with. And they really came up with the concept of, again, a second restoration, renovation of the church building and creating a nonprofit. And they are going to be the prime movers behind us becoming what we are today. and they engaged with a gentleman by the name of Henry Mason Day, who was a New York financier, but his heritage was in Isle of Wight County. His grandfather's buried here, and there's even ancestors of his that go back to 17th century. There's part of Isle of Wight called Day's Point. So they engaged with him because they knew he could bring in some significant financial backers into this project, which he certainly does. And so in 1953, historic St. Luke's restoration was created. And it's going to be about a 4-year project to do this second major renovation of the building as it pretty much currently appears. And they will bring in quite a significant amount of money and had some uh, very interesting backers locally here. We're known, of course, for Smithfield hams and Smithfield Foods became very much involved in it. Our second president was Joe Luter, head of Smithfield Foods, and also a Virginia politician by the name of AES Stevens, who was a lieutenant governor at one time, uh, was the third president. So there was a lot of pretty big names for Virginia involved in that original 1950s campaign as we became the nonprofit that we are today.
Okay. Now, why am I thinking or remembering I read something about Jamestown? Was there some
Yeah.
association?
So Jamestown is, of course, going through the 350th anniversary in 1957,
I see.
and they created Jamestown Settlement, which was meant to be a temporary exhibit. And it was so successful that it continues on to this day. Jamestown Settlement's part of Jamestown Yorktown Foundation that has the two museums, one commemorating the Jamestown settlement, and the other is the Museum of the American Revolution. And so there was this big celebration to commemorate 350 years since the settlement at Jamestown. And it happened to be the same weekend that um, Henry Mason Day declared the opening of St. Luke's once again. And so he was trying to tie him sure into the enthusiasm and big crowds for what was happening across the river in Jamestown.
Got it. Okay. That makes sense. Now, tell us the President Eisenhower story. How does he
Yeah,
get
so
involved?
yeah, in 1956, even before we're kind of reopening, there's the effort to make St. Luke's a national historic site. And so they apply for that. And Henry Mason Day, who had some really interesting political connections, writes to President Eisenhower for this effort. And kind of, I think, to much to surprise, gets a very warm and a cordial note from President Eisenhower congratulating St. Luke's on this effort. And as the 1950s is kind of this time of romanticizing of American history, his letters kind of suggests how St. Luke's is an emblem or a symbol of the um, patriotic and religious roots of our American story. And Henry Mason Day is just thrilled with this response from President Eisenhower, writes another letter to him, and he gets another telegram back again, kind of congratulating everyone involved on this great accomplishment. They're buying into a lot of the mythology about St. Luke's being the oldest Protestant church building. That was from a lot of misdating. They thought that the building was completed in 1632, which definitely is not the case. But we really didn't make that conclusion until even my tenure here in the last 12 years. So it's a kind of a very romanticized notion of American history, but it was a very lovely letter from him, and we became a national historic site, and he referred to it as a national shrine.
I think a national shrine to religious freedom. Is that could be
Yeah.
said?
Yeah, and that's kind of the way we actually do use it. We really use the old brick church as our setting to talk about the early American religious experience and now that we're coming up on Thanksgiving, there's always this narrative that we were born in religious freedom, which we certainly were not. Again, here in Virginia, you pay taxes to a particular branch of a Christian church, the Established Church of England. They were suppressing other religious groups very heavily. Quakers, especially, were targeted in both the 17th and 18th centuries. So religious freedom is really a much later occurrence as we become a new nation. And even then, it takes several decades before we see that on state levels.
Sure did. That's right. We'll make links to the letters and the telegram in the show notes. We'll put those in the show notes.
Yeah,
Did President Eisenhower ever visit?
he did not. He did not.
Do you want to share any particular stories of interest over its long history that you haven't shared yet? Anything that we've missed?
Yeah, well, one of my favorite things is to talk about is people have this idea that Virginia was something of a secular society where all the religious people were up in Massachusetts. That's really not even close to the case. And I always tell people, look at the laws that they write. Religious laws in Virginia were extremely strict. Um, Even profaning the name of God could get you the death penalty in early laws of Jamestown. Again, having to worship once a month, paying your tax to your local parish system. And there were a lot of dissenters, especially here in Isle of Wight in the early days. So even the year before Plymouth is formed up in what became Massachusetts, and we think of those Pilgrims, those same folks that were Brownists were coming to Isle of Wight before Plymouth is founded. So our earliest colonists here in what became Isle of Wight were these separatist movements. And there's an interesting series of letters that happens during the 1640s before our church building is built, uh, where one of the Puritan leaders, a young man named William Durand, is pleading to uh, the ministers up in Massachusetts to send down, as he called them, the godly ministers to the Sodom and Gomorrah of Virginia. And they come down, and then Governor Barkley kicks them out when he takes power in 1642, just as the English Civil Wars are starting. So a lot of the things that are creating the Civil Wars back in England are happening right here in Virginia. So I think that's kind of interesting that our earliest roots here have a lot of that, both Pilgrim and Puritan roots. And then Quakers became a very significant movement from the 1650s into the 1670s. And in early 18th century, there was a Quaker by the name of John Ratcliffe who actually tacked a pamphlet to the door of our old brick church, kind of condemning the Anglican theology around the sacrament of communion.
Really?
And he gets arrested for it. We don't know exactly what happened to him. I really would love to find some more documentation to find out what they did with him, if they just fined him or what happened to him. But it's kind of this dramatic scene of almost Martin Luther like of
Sure.
tacking the pamphlet to the door. So there's a lot of religious rivalries that are going on right up and through the American Revolution.
That's a great story.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing those. Why should people visit St. Luke's Historic Church today, and how should they view its significance to their participation in the American project?
Yeah. So our major mission is to teach about the early American religious experience, just as your institution does, and really bring to light the fact that religious freedom is something we can't take for granted. The 17th century was one of the most violent centuries in human history, marred by a great deal of religious violence. You think about the wars of religion in France and the Netherlands. The 30 Years' War in the heart of Europe was one of the most gruesome conflicts in human history. There were 90% casualties in places like the Siege of Magdeburg. And these were all inter-Christian wars. And that horrific violence, I think, really uh, has an effect on our founding fathers and mothers as they reflect upon that violence and begin to realize that the marriage of government and religion really has been a major cause of significant violence throughout history. And you begin to see these stirrings of the idea of freedom of the individual to decide for themselves what their relationship's going to be like with God. And Virginia really takes the spearhead in this. If you look at Thomas Jefferson's Statutes for Religious Freedom for the state of Virginia that was passed in 1786, and you see no establishment, you see no religious test for holding public office. All the things that are going to wind up in the Constitution were right there in the Virginia statutes the year before they gathered in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. And so we tell this story of those very religiously repressive laws of the 17th century in which our building was built and how we move into the freedoms that we have today and ask the question, can we keep those freedoms because they're very much in jeopardy in the present day? And we believe that if there isn't religious freedom for all of us, there really isn't religious freedom for any of us, and that the government shouldn't have that kind of power to decide what we ought to believe and how we ought to worship or not worship.
Okay. Sounds like a great place to come. If one comes, what is there to do? What are your hours?
Yeah,
What
so
are
we're
the
open to
cost?
the public Thursday through Saturdays. We're open 9:30 to 5. Our basic tour is a self-guided tour. We use an app called the Bloomberg Connects app, which is a wonderful a group. Old Mayor of New York, Mayor Bloomberg, created this app that has over 1,000 museums and cultural institutions on it, and we're one of the guides on it. And it'll take you through stops throughout the cemetery and inside the church building, and tells that long history of our parish and the wider uh, history of religion in Virginia and the United States. There's a lot of videos connected with it. We tell stories about the original peoples of this area called the Waraskoyak, and talk about issues about race and the church's complicity in that. So there's a lot of deep diving on that. If there's groups of 10 or more, we do guided tours as well. And we have many, many special events during the year. We have certainly many lectures. We have a 17th century living history event with reenactors of both indigenous people and colonists. And we have period concerts. And we do a cemetery tour every October and talk about some of the biographies of some of the folks interred there. And so there's a lot of great opportunities to understand the origins of this country and the central role that religion had in those formative years of our republic.
Okay. For our listeners to sort of understand where this is, what's the closest town to Smithfield? What's the closest town to the church that people
Well,
will?
Smithfield is the town. We're in Isle of Wight County, Virginia. We're on the south side of the James River. So people often take the ferry over from Jamestown
Okay.
and visit here, or folks from other south side from Virginia Beach, Chesapeake area come here. So there's that's really the only town is Smithfield, and bigger towns around the peninsula like Hampton, Norfolk,
Okay.
those places. That's all surrounding Hampton Roads region.
Okay. Hampton Road region. Got it. Okay. Last question, John. And uh, and we ask all of our guests this question. As we conclude, do you want to share any lessons or takeaways from what we discussed today? Your place there, St. Luke's Historic Church and Museum, and its significance, either in terms of important historical transformations you are charting as a historian, or in terms of helping us better understand our present moment in the American narrative? You spoke a little bit about this in answer to the last question, but anything else you want to say?
Yeah, for us, what's very important is to tell, the fullest scope of history that we can. So one of the things we've tried to focus on during my time here has been what we refer to as undertold narratives, and that involves what the African American experience was like, what the Indigenous experience was like vis-a-vis the established Church of England, or the role of women in the period. We did an exhumation of a woman named Anne Randall, who was a 17th century woman who was relocated from her original grave at White Marsh, which was Joseph Bridges' plantation, to the old brick church and to the chancel floor. And It's a rare case of having a lot of data on a named woman from the period. Most often you're hearing about men and large names that appear in all the history books, but to have more ordinary people and uh, people that were so often undervalued and excluded from the histories are something that we really want to bring to light for people. So we work with the local tribes, like the Nansemond tribe, who are kind of the group that the Warraskoyak eventually kind of merged in with. And they do a wonderful job of talking about their history within the colony of Virginia. So we partner with them, and we want to make sure that everyone who comes here, knows the first peoples of this place. We think that's really important because so often we imagine history sort of begins when the English show up, and that's certainly, of course, not the case. So it's really important for us to tell the inclusive story of all the different groups that made up our Virginia colony and the early American Republic.
Okay. Sounds like you're doing a great job there. Thank you for all your work there. We have been talking with John Ericson, the executive director of St. Luke's Historic Church and Museum in Smithfield, Virginia. John, thank you so very much.
Well, thank you, Chris. We appreciate the work that you do.
The podcast series Religion in the American Experience is a project of the National Museum of American Religion. Episodes will be released monthly on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.